Is in something of a crisis in Washington, D.C., as they continue to use the U.S. Attorney's Office and the DOJ to try and crack down on their political opponents. Can you explain what just happened in D.C.?
Yeah, Brian, 6 times now, D.C. grand juries have told Jeanine Pirro, that would be Donald Trump's U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, 6 times grand jury told her no to felony charges. She was seeking felony indictments of 4 different defendants, and her prosecutors presented those 4 cases a total of 6 times. We can break down the numbers in a minute. And in what has got to be an unprecedented turn of events, the grand jury said no 6 times. You know, they will not buy in to Jeanine Pirro's overreach, to her abuse of the grand jury, or to her outright prosecutorial misconduct. And I think, you know, crisis is probably a good word. Let's face it, the people of the District of Columbia will not go gently into the good dictatorship that Donald Trump is trying to create by militarizing the streets of Washington, D.C., and it looks like it is reverberating inside grand jury rooms. So let me just break down what's gone on here. You know, our viewers are probably most familiar with the guy who tossed a Subway sandwich at a police officer, and Jeanine Pirro went into the grand jury, ordered her prosecutors to go into the grand jury and seek a felony indictment. 8 years in prison, max punishment, for throwing a sandwich at a police officer, and the grand jury said, oh, hell no, and that case got broken all the way down to a misdemeanor, so that case may end up in trial as a misdemeanor charge. Then there was a woman named Sydney Lori Reed. She is someone who stepped in between an ICE agent and an FBI agent who were trying to take into custody somebody because of their immigration status. There was some pushing and shoveling and a minor scuffle, and Jeanine Pirro sent her people into the grand jury to try to indict Sydney Lori Reed for a felony assault on a police officer. And again, the grand jury said, oh, hell no, and it looks like that case may proceed by a misdemeanor. Now, it's important to know she presented the Sydney Lori Reed case to 3 different grand juries, which I view as a career prosecutor as an abuse of the grand jury process. All 3 grand juries said no. So now we have 2 new entrants into, you know, the resistance that, you know, is being shown by the grand jury. There's somebody named Natalie Rose Jones who allegedly threatened Donald Trump. She came here, she protested, she may have posted some threats on Instagram or on Facebook. She was arrested, and again, Jeanine Pirro sent her prosecutors into the grand jury seeking felony indictments, and the grand jury said no. So Natalie Rose Jones is not presently indicted. Now there's a 4th defendant, guy named Alvin Summers. This one comes with a little bit of a twist. He was alleged to have engaged in some kind of an assault. I'm not sure if it was during a protest or otherwise on a police officer. And again, the grand jury refused to indict Alvin Summers. Here's the interesting twist, Brian. After the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., headed up by Jeanine Pirro, could not get a felony indictment on Alvin Summers, they moved to dismiss the case. They moved to dismiss it without prejudice, which means Jeanine Pirro, anytime she was feeling like it, could try to gin up those charges again and put them back before a grand jury. But Alvin Summers' lawyer just filed a motion seeking to have that case thrown out with prejudice, meaning Jeanine Pirro could never try to bring it again before a grand jury. And I just pulled this up off the court docket. The judge ordered Jeanine Pirro's prosecutors to respond to Alvin Summers' attorney's motion to dismiss it with prejudice by September 5th. So it looks like we may have some litigation about just how cruddy Jeanine Pirro is being, how abusive, how much overreach she is engaged in by repeatedly trying to get felony indictments when it's pretty clear the evidence does not warrant those felony indictments.
We've heard the saying that any prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. And so how unorthodox is it that not just one, not just two, not just three, but in four separate instances, we have seen these grand juries push back. Well, more than that, I mean six, because one of those instances was three separate attempts by Jeanine Pirro. But we've seen in six separate instances these grand juries push back on what should otherwise be a pretty routine indictment at the hands of these attorneys, these prosecutors.
Brian, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it is entirely unprecedented. One of the things I did is I reached out to a number of my former colleagues who were also career prosecutors, some of them longer than me, 135 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia. People generally can't even remember one grand jury voting no. We call that no billing the case. They can't even remember one no bill. Somebody did recall one, but to have six no bills in the span of just a few weeks or a month or so, I can't imagine that has happened in any jurisdiction anywhere in the country. But here's what our viewers need to know. Part of what might be going on is not just the grand jurors, taking their oath very seriously to indict only if the evidence and the law supports a felony indictment. They take an oath to do so without fear or favor. And let me tell you, Brian, they are performing an important civic duty, an important public service, making sure that they are a check against prosecutorial overreach and abuse. And they give up literally weeks and months at a time when they're called to serve on grand juries. There are two kinds of grand juries in D.C. One grand jury, if you're called for grand jury duty, you sit in that grand jury in that windowless room for 6 weeks, 5 days a week. That's the Superior Court grand jury. The federal court grand jury, you're on it for 18 months, 8 days a month for 18 months. Brian, these people give up their jobs for that period of time. They're away from their families. If they happen to be stay-at-home moms or dads, they have to arrange for childcare. This is an enormous ask of these people to perform this important civic duty. And I hope our viewers are sitting down, because let me tell you how Jeanine Pirro just publicly berated the grand jurors who refused to bend to her will and Donald Trump's will. Here is what Jeanine Pirro said on a Fox News appearance. Remember, her qualifications for being United States Attorney is that she used to be a Fox News host, and she sat down with a fellow Fox News host. Here's what she said about the D.C. grand jurors. These are people that she has sworn to protect and serve in her capacity as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. She said she blamed the jurors for failing to grasp the reality of the crime that is occurring because they, the grand jurors, live in Georgetown or other affluent neighborhoods. Brian, that's stone cold bullshit. I spent decades inside those grand jury rooms, and grand jurors are summoned from all of the quadrants, all of the neighborhoods of D.C., and they're not just the affluent Georgetown types. I suspect Jeanine Pirro has never been inside a D.C. grand jury room, but it gets worse. She said, "My office has been instructed to move for the highest crime possible, consistent with the law, the statute, and the evidence. And in that one case," referring to the guy who threw a Subway sandwich, "we were on point, but the grand jurors don't take it so seriously. They're like, whatever." That's a quote. Well said, Jeanine. And then she disses them one more time by saying the following. D.C. residents are so used to crime, that crime is so normalized in D.C. that they don't even care about whether or not the law is violated. Close quote from Jeanine Pirro, publicly berating, disrespecting, and demeaning the grand jurors in Washington, D.C. Brian, D.C. may be a big city, but it's also a very small town. Word will spread that this is what Jeanine Pirro is saying about jurors, grand jurors, trial jurors, and things are likely to get a whole lot worse for Jeanine Pirro in her attempt to bring charges that are not supported by the evidence.
That's actually what I was just going to ask you about is what are the downstream effects? What could be the subsequent ramifications of the continued and failing weaponization of government as it relates to not just the jurors, and I want you to talk about that, but also the legal system more broadly? Like, is there ever a point at which judges step in or defense attorneys step in and use the fact that we have seen such overt weaponization to actually undermine subsequent cases that the government brings?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brian. Defense attorneys will absolutely use this to maximum advantage, maybe not as it directly impacts the case of their client, but kind of the atmospheric impact. Grand jurors are supposed to do their work without fear or favor, based only on the facts and the law. And if Jeanine Pirro is starting to berate them and maybe even implicitly or tacitly threatening or intimidating them, you better indict the felony charges we say to indict, or we're going to continue to publicly berate you while you're performing this important civic duty. That can definitely have tentacles that will reach out into any number of cases that make their way into court. The other thing that might end up happening, I still think that the D.C. grand jurors will take their oath seriously, and they won't necessarily let Jeanine Pirro's horrifically inappropriate comments infect their work as grand jurors. But it might result in, for example, the Trump administration and the Department of Justice trying to find other venues. Often, like if you make a threat in interstate commerce, meaning you post it online so it travels to other states, sometimes the Department of Justice can pick and choose where it might try to indict a case. And I predict that you're going to start to see cases that are more appropriately presented to a grand jury in D.C., perhaps being taken in other jurisdictions, like right across the river from D.C. at the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office and federal court and grand jury. So I think they're going to try to get a little bit slippery and maybe find ways around having grand juries that are properly empowered to hear a case, maybe trying to take those cases away from that grand jury. But listen, anytime a public official, the top prosecutor in D.C., who is sworn to protect and serve the people of D.C., starts to publicly berate them, that is a recipe for the further disintegration and disruption of the criminal justice system as it operates in D.C.
And so is there any concern now that we're going to see a way to pervert this so that they can get a more favorable venue in terms of bringing these cases forward?
It's going to be hard to get around. So the venue question is, in what court should this case properly be brought? Where did the brunt of the crime occur? And it's going to be, tough if you have protests or you have citizens who are, kind of being very vocal, very forward-leaning when it comes to the either the military troops or the federal police officers who are being deployed to the streets of Washington, D.C., really designed to kind of intimidate the citizenry, in my estimation, at least in part. If an attempted assault of a police officer occurs in the District of Columbia, I don't think there's any way to legitimately bring that case in another venue, in another jurisdiction, unless there is some interstate component to it,
Right.
like somebody traveled across state lines intending to assault or level a threat against the president. But, this is going to be a mess. What I do think is that the federal courts will continue to be up to the task. The federal judiciary is actually responsible for overseeing the grand jury process. People think the grand jury is an arm of the executive branch of the prosecutor's office. Not so. It's an arm of the court. So the court has significant supervisory responsibility over grand juries, and that is a good thing given the way Jeanine Pirro is conducting herself.
Well, look, we will continue to stay on top of any news that breaks as it relates to these attempted and failed indictments of the political opponents of this administration. For those who are watching right now, if you'd like to support our work, please make sure to subscribe. I'll put the links to both of our channels right here on the screen. Great way to support us. It is completely free and a great way to support independent media. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.